What happens when the place everyone calls home never feels that way to you? When the walls that should hold comfort and safety only close in tighter, and the air you breathe is thick with something you can't quite name? For years, I asked this question quietly, hoping someone would hear the fear and confusion that settled deep inside me. But every time I tried to explain, I was met with dismissive eyes and words that cut sharper than any argument. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. Those words echoed around me like a cruel mantra, convincing me that maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was just too fragile to live here. To the outside world, our house looked like any other, calm, respectable, safe. Neighbors smiled when they passed by, friends admired the neat lawn, and no one suspected a thing. But inside, I lived with a constant gnawing sense of unease, a feeling that something was deeply, undeniably wrong. It wasn't loud or obvious. There were no slamming doors or raised voices. Instead, it was in the quiet tension that hung in the air, the unspoken rules that nobody talked about but everyone followed, the invisible lines I tiptoed around every single day. I tried to put it into words, but they never seemed enough. How do you explain the weight pressing down on your chest when everything looks fine? How do you make others see the patterns that only someone living there could feel? The calculated silences, the sideways glances, the way smiles barely reached the eyes. I was trapped in a world where my reality was questioned, where my pain was minimized, and where my truth was dismissed as paranoia. It's a lonely place to be, isolated by the very people who should understand you best. The worst part was not the fear itself, but the disbelief. To be told you're wrong about your own home is a kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any argument. I began to doubt myself, to question whether I was truly imagining the tension that never let me rest. But then, something happened. An outsider, someone who had never lived under the same roof, spent just one night in our house.
No dramatique confrontation, no shouting, no autours.
Just a single night. And in that quiet passage of ours, the walls spoke in ways that words never could. The doubt that had smothered me for so long started to crack. The label of overreacting began to fall apart. Suddenly, the invisible lines were seen. The patterns I had tried to explain were undeniable. It was a moment that should have brought relief, but also opened wounds too deep to heal overnight. That one night changed everything. But what exactly happened in those hours? And why did it take an outsider's presence for the truth to finally be recognized? The answers lie just beyond the darkness of that evening, waiting to be uncovered. It's in those quiet, fragile moments after the truth begins to surface that everything shifts, the familiar becomes unfamiliar, and the weight you've carried alone suddenly feels shared, even if only just a little. Sometimes, the stories we hold inside don't have clear words or neat conclusions. They're tangled in years of quiet judgment, confusion, and the unspoken rules that govern family life. If you've ever found yourself questioning your own feelings or wondering if what you experienced was real, you're not alone. There's a certain relief in recognizing that these experiences aren't just in your head, that others have felt the same invisible burdens. As this story unfolds, you'll hear the moments where silence spoke louder than any argument, and where the presence of someone outside the family circle became a catalyst for truth, something that was always there but hidden beneath layers of denial and pain. It's not about blame or simple answers. It's about understanding the complexity of family dynamics, the quiet judgments that shape us, and the courage it takes to face the parts of ourselves and others we'd rather keep hidden. If you find pieces of your own story reflected here, know that this space is for listening and for sharing when you're ready. There's no rush to respond now, but whenever you feel inclined, your thoughts or experiences could add to a conversation that many have found quietly healing. And if these real-life stories mean something to you, if they offer a glimpse of truth or a sense of connection, consider staying with us. Subscribing here isn't about numbers or noise, it's about building a place where honest, heartfelt stories can be heard and valued. Together, we can explore what it means to live under the same roof with history, judgment, and the hope for understanding. I remember the first time I mentioned the way the front door never quite closed right, how it creaked loudly every time someone came in, and how that noise jolted me awake on more nights than I could count. It was a small thing, but for me it was a sign that something wasn't quite right, something unsettled about the house, or maybe just about the way we lived in it. When I brought it up, my voice cautious, almost hesitant, the reply came quickly and without much thought. "You're overreacting," my sibling said, brushing it off with a casual wave of their hand. "It's just a door. Doors make noise. You're making it bigger than it is." The words felt like a soft slap, a dismissal wrapped in a familiar tone that I was still learning to recognize. I tried to explain how the sound pulled at my nerves, but they laughed, shaking their head. Seriously, you're too sensitive. It's not scary, it's just a door. As time passed, the patterns settled like dust on the shelves. Every time I shared a worry, no matter how small or practical, the reaction was the same, a quick dismissal, sometimes a laugh, sometimes a sigh. When I mentioned the uneven floorboards that creaked underfoot, making footsteps echo too loudly in the quiet, the response was, "You're imagining things again. The house is fine." When I asked if maybe the draft coming through the cracked window could be fixed, I heard, "You're making problems out of nothing. It's just a bit of cold air." What stung most wasn't the specific concerns themselves, but the certainty with which they were dismissed. It wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. I started to second-guess myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining problems where none existed. Maybe the door really was just a door. One evening, I mentioned the way the kitchen light flickered unpredictably when the power surged. It made me uneasy, like the house was unsettled, or tired, or maybe even warning us. My voice was low, careful, as if I was admitting to a secret I barely understood. "It flickers all the time. It feels like the house isn't steady." My mom looked up from her book, a faint smile teasing the corner of her mouth. "You're overreacting again. Lights flicker sometimes. It's not a big deal." Then she added, almost teasingly, "Maybe you've got a vivid imagination." I forced a small laugh, but inside, a little piece of confidence chipped away. Was I really imagining things? I tried to pay attention less, to ignore the creaks, the drafts, the flickers, but the unease didn't go away. It just settled deeper, like a shadow growing longer in the fading light. One afternoon, I pointed out the peeling paint near the baseboards and the odd smell that lingered in the basement. "Don't you think it's time to fix that? It feels like the house is falling apart." My dad looked up from the newspaper, raised an eyebrow, and said, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill." Then he shook his head, almost amused. "You always see things worse than they are. It's just old paint and some mustiness. Nothing to worry about." Each time, the words echoed in my mind after the conversation ended, twisting around like an invisible knot. I found myself shrinking back, less willing to speak up, less sure of what I felt or noticed. What once felt like clear signals became blurry and uncertain. I wondered if maybe the house was fine and I was just too fragile, too watchful. Maybe these worries were just shadows I cast myself. The label overreacting became a quiet weight pressing down on me. It wasn't shouted in anger or cruelty, it was said with a casual certainty that made me question my own senses. Slowly, those words carved out a space inside me where doubt grew, and my own voice became softer, more tentative, less sure it deserved to be heard at all. From the street, the house stood as a quiet sentinel of stability, its pale cream siding glowing softly in the afternoon sun. Neatly trimmed hedges framed the front walkway, each leaf meticulously cared for, a testament to the pride its owners took in their home. The windows gleamed clean, reflecting the calm suburban sky, while the porch swing rocked gently in the breeze, inviting passers-by to imagine moments of relaxed conversation and laughter. It was the kind of house neighbors admired without hesitation, a symbol of order and comfort in a bustling world. When guests arrived, their footsteps on the polished stone path echoed a familiar rhythm of warmth and welcome. Relatives often complimented the home with genuine admiration. "You've created such a beautiful place," my aunt once said during a weekend visit, her eyes scanning the freshly painted walls and the well-appointed flower beds. "It's like stepping into a magazine spread," she added, her voice tinged with envy and delight. Neighbors, too, would stop by occasionally, leaning over their fences to exchange pleasantries and praise. "Your garden is always the crown jewel of the block," Mrs. Lane would say with a smile, gesturing toward the blooming roses and carefully arranged tulips. Inside, the living room's soft lighting and tasteful decor hinted at a family that valued harmony and tradition. The scent of freshly brewed coffee or baked goods often drifted into the hallway, pulling visitors into a comforting embrace. The dining table, polished and set with fine china, spoke of shared meals and celebrations. The walls bore framed photographs capturing moments of smiles and togetherness, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, all frozen in time and radiating a sense of belonging. Neighbors and friends often remarked on the family's reputation as well. "You all seem so close," one would say, eyes warm with genuine respect. It's rare to see a household where everyone truly supports each other. The family name carried a quiet dignity in the community, synonymous with reliability and kindness. Invitations to gatherings, holiday parties, and casual barbecues were frequent, and the house was often the backdrop for laughter and cheer, a place where memories were made and treasured. Yet, beneath this serene surface, a subtle tension hummed just out of sight. For me, the polished exterior felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile mask. Each compliment, each admiring glance, deepened the weight of my silence. The house's perfection, so admired by others, only heightened my sense of being out of place, as if the unspoken truths inside clashed with a peaceful image projected outward. The spotless floors and gleaming windows seemed to reflect not just light but also the sharp edges of my unease, edges I carefully concealed from view. This carefully crafted image of normalcy acted as a shield, guarding the family's reputation and the house's dignity from any hint of discord. The praise of neighbors and relatives, while comforting to some, often felt like a barrier to admitting the complexity beneath. I found myself shrinking inside the very walls others found so inviting, the invisible fractures hidden beneath layers of paint and polish. The house was admired, respected, even envied, and yet in its quiet perfection, it protected secrets that no one outside could see, secrets I was only beginning to understand. There was a peculiar stillness that seemed to settle over the house long before nightfall, a pause in the usual rhythms that other homes wore like a familiar coat. It wasn't the absence of sound but the way silence filled the spaces, thick, layered, and expectant. Conversations would taper off suddenly, as if an invisible line had been crossed, and eyes would flicker away, settling on some undisturbed corner or the slow crawl of shadows against the wall. The moments between words stretched, waited with an unspoken understanding that certain things were better left unsaid. I learned early on to read those silences not as emptiness but as signals, subtle warnings that shaped every interaction. No one ever spelled out the rules, but the atmosphere was governed by them, rigid and unyielding. Smiles were measured, laughter contained, and gestures carefully calibrated. A raised voice or a sudden movement could cause an immediate, almost imperceptible shift in the room's energy, like a stone disturbing a still pond. Eyes would narrow slightly, shoulders would stiffen, and the air thickened with a quiet tension that seemed to whisper of consequences beyond what was visible. I wasn't sure if the rules were written by the house or by the people who lived within it, but I quickly understood that breaking them, even accidentally, would unravel something fragile, something better left intact. Emotional currents ran deep yet unpredictable, like hidden streams beneath a smooth surface. There was no outpouring of feelings, no tears, no raised voices, no embraces. Instead, moods shifted subtly, like the change of light through frosted glass. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a sigh swallowed just before it escaped, a glance held a second too long or withdrawn too quickly, each gesture spoke volumes in its restraint. I learned to watch for the smallest fissures in expressions, the way a jaw might tighten or a hand tremble briefly before stilling. These moments never came with explanations, but they left traces, a residue of unease that I carried with me, a constant sense that beneath the calm lay a restless storm. The tension was less about confrontation and more about a persistent undercurrent of vigilance. I moved through the rooms like a careful dancer, timing my steps to avoid disrupting the fragile balance. I learned to anticipate moods, adjusting my tone and pace, softening my presence so as not to draw attention or provoke discomfort. It was a performance of quiet compliance, a silent negotiation to keep the peace. When voices rose even slightly in frustration, I would withdraw, retreating inwardly, shrinking not out of fear but necessity, knowing that my survival depended on blending into the background, on becoming almost invisible. This unspoken choreography extended beyond interactions to the very way I inhabited the space. I avoided occupying certain chairs, steering clear of rooms where shadows seemed to linger longer. I learned to keep my belongings minimal and neatly arranged, hoping to avoid stirring any latent irritations. There was a constant vigilance about what I said and how I said it, a mental checklist running in the background to ensure I didn't cross invisible borders. The house became a maze of delicate boundaries, each step carefully measured, each word weighed before release. Yet, despite this constant adjustment, the source of my discomfort remained elusive, a persistent fog that clouded my sense of belonging. It was not a matter of overt hostility but an intangible barrier, a feeling that I was perpetually out of sync with an unspoken rhythm. The unease was in the small things, the way the air seemed to hold its breath just before someone entered a room, the way conversations would pause abruptly when I spoke, as if waiting for permission to continue. It was a quiet tension that never broke into conflict but never fully eased either, a steady reminder that I was navigating a landscape defined as much by what was hidden as by what was visible. At first, I thought that if I just explained what felt wrong, if I could put into words the heaviness that clung to every corner of the house, maybe the silence would break. Maybe the tension would ease. So I tried. I spoke up, tentatively at first, asking questions about the strange silences, the stifled conversations, the moments when looks were exchanged like secret codes I wasn't meant to understand. I hoped someone would meet me halfway, that I wouldn't have to carry this alone. But each time I tried, my words seemed to fall into an invisible void. Sometimes, a dismissive chuckle would follow, as if I were imagining things or making mountains out of molehills. "You're overthinking," someone said once, brushing off my concerns with a wave. Another time, when I mentioned how the air felt thick with unspoken things, a family member laughed outright, mocking my sensitivity. Their laughter wasn't gentle, it was sharp, cutting, like a way to remind me that this wasn't a space for my feelings or questions. The worst moments weren't the outright mockery, but the quiet dismissals that came wrapped in smiles or impatience. "You're just being dramatic," a voice would say, almost kindly, but the words stung all the same. The way people would glance away, change the subject, or suddenly become busy with other tasks made me feel like my experience was invisible, like my presence itself was an inconvenience. After a while, I stopped speaking up altogether. It was exhausting to pour my heart out only to be met with disbelief or ridicule. I learned to hold my tongue, to keep my thoughts bottled up where they couldn't be dismissed or twisted. The silence became my refuge, but it was a lonely one. I was surrounded by people, yet entirely alone with the weight of what I felt but could no longer share. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a quiet separation that grew thicker each day. That silence carved out a space inside me where doubt took root. If no one else saw what I saw or felt what I felt, maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe the unease wasn't real. But deep down, I knew that the heaviness in the house wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was mine to carry alone. The more I kept silent, the more that feeling settled into the corners of my mind, a quiet ache that was hard to name but impossible to ignore. In those moments, I realized that sometimes explaining isn't enough. Sometimes it's met with walls that won't budge, no matter how softly or clearly you speak. And when those walls rise, the only choice left is to retreat, to protect yourself from the pain of being unheard or misunderstood. It's a lonely path, but it's one I had to walk to keep some part of myself intact. If you've ever been in a place where your feelings about your home or family were dismissed as exaggeration or overreaction, I'd really like to hear from you. It's not easy to share, and it's not a competition of who has it worse. But sometimes, knowing you're not alone in that experience can make the silence a little less heavy. Please feel free to share your story or just a few words below. Your voice matters. For a long time, I held on to the hope that if I just explained things clearly enough, if I just found the right words, someone would finally understand what felt so wrong beneath the surface. I tried to put my feelings into sentences, to describe the tension that hung in the air like an invisible weight, the small but constant disappointments that added up day after day. But every time I spoke up, my words seemed to bounce off walls that were too thick to penetrate. Instead of being heard, I was met with sighs, eye rolls, or worse, mockery. It was as if my feelings were a joke, a performance I was putting on for attention, not the genuine struggle I was trying to express. I remember one night, after a particularly tense dinner, I tried again. I told a family member how isolated I felt, how the silence wasn't peaceful but heavy, suffocating. Their response was a chuckle and a dismissive, "You're just being dramatic. It's not that bad." That moment stung more than I could say. It wasn't just about feeling unheard, it was about feeling invisible, as though my reality had been rewritten by others to fit a narrative that erased my pain. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I was overreacting, if maybe the way I felt was a fault of my own imagination. There were other times too, when I tried to explain the small moments that chipped away at my sense of safety and belonging. How the constant criticism at home made me shrink inside. How the silent treatment was more painful than any argument. But those words landed like stones in a vast, empty room. Not only was I dismissed, but sometimes the people I trusted most would laugh, saying things like, "You're too sensitive," or "You need to toughen up." Those words cut deeper than any argument because they told me my feelings were invalid, that my pain was my own fault. This pattern repeated itself so many times that eventually, I stopped trying. I stopped searching for the right way to explain what I was feeling because I realized that no matter how carefully I chose my words, no one seemed ready to listen. The walls of misunderstanding grew higher, and the space where I once reached out became emptier. It wasn't just silence anymore, it was a barrier. I learned to keep my thoughts locked away, to protect myself from the sting of dismissal. I withdrew into a quiet world where my feelings could exist without judgment, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. The emotional isolation that followed was profound. It was a loneliness wrapped in the irony of being surrounded by people, but feeling completely alone. There were days when the silence felt like a chasm I couldn't cross, and nights when the ache of invisibility made sleep impossible. Yet, in that solitude, I began to understand the importance of holding on to my own truth, even if no one else seemed to believe it. I learned that sometimes, the hardest part is not being misunderstood by others, but convincing yourself that your feelings matter. If you've ever had your feelings dismissed or been told you were exaggerating or overreacting about your own home or family situation, I want you to know you're not alone. It's not easy to share these parts of ourselves, especially when the people closest to us don't see or believe what we're going through. If you feel comfortable, I'd really like to hear your story or even just a few words about your experience. Sometimes, knowing others have walked similar paths can make the silence feel a little less heavy. Your voice matters, and here, it's safe to share it. The evening arrived with a quiet urgency, the kind that hovers just beneath the surface of routine. The air in the house felt thicker than usual, as if it were holding its breath alongside me. I found myself pacing the small living room, fingers tracing the edge of the worn coffee table, eyes flicking toward the front door every few minutes. The clock ticked steadily, a metronome to the anxious rhythms inside me. Outside, the world dimmed softly, streetlights flickering on, casting long shadows through the windows. When the knock finally came, it was tentative, almost hesitant. My heart jumped as I opened the door to find them standing there, a quiet presence framed by the soft glow of the porch light. Their smile was small, a little unsure, matching the nervous energy pulsing between us. We exchanged greetings that felt heavier than usual, words caught in the space where expectation met hesitation. They stepped inside, carrying nothing but a small bag, and the door closed behind us with a soft click that echoed in the suddenly still room. The house seemed to shrink around the two of us. I noticed how the light from the single lamp cast long, uncertain shadows across the floor, the silence pressing in where conversation might have been. We settled into the worn couch, sitting just far enough apart to avoid the awkwardness of proximity, but close enough that the space between us hummed with unspoken thoughts. Our eyes met briefly before darting away, as if afraid to reveal too much in that moment. Minutes stretched thin, filled with the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional clearing of throats. I caught myself watching the way their fingers fiddled with the strap of their bag, a subtle nervous tick, while they caught glimpses of the framed photos on the wall, images of a life they only knew from stories, now made tangible in this shared space. I wondered if they felt the weight of those memories too, or if the house held only silence for them. Dinner was a quiet affair, plates clinking softly amid the stillness. The conversation stumbled, words falling short or trailing into hesitations. We spoke in fragments, comments about the weather, the way the light shifted with the setting sun, anything to fill the gaps without pushing too hard. The air between us was taut, like a thread stretched too thin, waiting to snap or to hold. Later, as the night deepened, we moved to the living room again, the dim light casting a gentle glow over the familiar furniture. They curled up with a blanket pulled tight, knees drawn close, while I kept my gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fireplace, though no fire burned. The quiet was no longer just empty, it was charged, alive with the tension of unsaid things. I sensed their thoughts drifting, perhaps circling the edges of what they wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. Sleep came reluctantly. The guest room felt both foreign and intimate, a space shared yet divided by walls and distance. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the faint sounds, the slow rhythm of breathing, the occasional shift of weight in the bed. In the darkness, I imagined the night stretching endlessly between us, filled with the promise of connection yet marked by the delicate barriers we hadn't crossed. By morning, the quiet hope that had hovered all night seemed to settle softly, like dust in a sunbeam. There were no grand gestures or sudden revelations, only the gentle presence of someone who had crossed the threshold and stayed, if only for a while. And in that simple act, a fragile bridge was built, quiet but steady, beneath the weight of unspoken understanding. The early light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a pale, muted glow across the room. The outsider sat on the edge of the bed, fingers loosely intertwined, eyes tracing the patterns of sunlight stretching across the floor. There was a stillness about them now, but it was not the calm of rest. It was sharper, more alert, as if every small sound or movement pulled their attention taut. Their shoulders, which had once carried a relaxed ease in the company of others, now sat slightly hunched, as though bracing against some invisible weight. Across the room, the familiar face watched quietly, sensing the shift but unsure how to bridge the widening space. The outsider's breath was steady, but not steady enough to betray true ease. It carried a subtle tension, a rhythm just off from the slow, even pace of sleep. Their eyes flicked away quickly when met, avoiding prolonged contact, yet in the brief glances there lingered a mixture of something almost like regret and something fiercely guarded. The stranger who had arrived the night before, the one who had spoken softly, who had laughed with an unexpected warmth, now seemed to retreat further into themselves, as if reluctant to claim the morning fully. No words came immediately. The quiet between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged, as if something unsaid hovered delicately in the air, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The outsider's hands moved occasionally, tracing idle patterns on their lap, fingers tapping lightly against the fabric, betraying a restless energy beneath the composed exterior. Every so often, their gaze would lift to the window, focusing intently on the world outside, then drop abruptly, as if afraid to linger on the possibility of what that world might hold. There was a subtle shift in the tone of their breathing, a slight catch at intervals, as if memories or decisions pressed hard against the walls of their chest. The familiar face, watching, felt an unspoken question simmering beneath the surface, a delicate line drawn between what was and what could be. Yet the outsider remained mute, their voice held back like a secret too fragile to risk, too raw to expose just yet. Their posture, once relaxed, had grown taut, the muscles beneath their skin coiled lightly as if poised for flight or confrontation. They straightened slowly, shoulders rolling back with a measured breath, as if gathering strength for what was to come. But instead of speaking, they merely rose and moved to the window, hands pressed lightly against the cool glass. The gesture was simple, almost absent-minded, yet it carried the weight of distance, between inside and outside, between them and the quiet hope that had lingered through the night. Still, the outsider's profile remained sharp against the morning light, eyes narrowing slightly as they studied the horizon. There was a flicker of something new there, something resolute, maybe even defiant, but it was buried beneath layers of uncertainty that had not yet unraveled. The other waited, patience a quiet anchor, sensing that when the words finally came, they would reshape the fragile bridge they'd built, solidify or shatter the tentative connection formed in the dark. For now, silence reigned, but it was a silence heavy with promise and peril, the kind that hums just before a confession or a goodbye. The outsider's body language spoke volumes in its stillness, guarded, watchful, not quite home yet, but no longer a stranger entirely. The morning stretched on, fragile and uncertain, holding its breath in anticipation of the moment when the quiet tension would break, and the true story would begin to unfold. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently. The familiar rhythm of daily life went on, but beneath the surface, something subtle yet irrevocable had shifted. It wasn't marked by loud arguments or explosive confrontations. Instead, it was the small, almost imperceptible changes that began to weave a new fabric of unease through the family's interactions. The silence didn't disappear, it morphed into something heavier, like a fog settling over conversations that once flowed easily. At first, the cracks were easy to overlook. A glance held a moment too long, a hesitation before answering a question, an abrupt change of subject. These moments were brushed aside as mere awkwardness, perhaps fatigue, or the discomfort of navigating new territory. But gradually, the weight of what had passed that night made itself known in the way the family members avoided each other's eyes, in the careful measured tones they adopted when speaking. The laughter that once filled the rooms became rarer, more fragile, and when it came it felt forced, as though everyone was testing the edges of a fragile mask. No one spoke openly of belief or disbelief. The idea that something unspoken might hold true crept into the background of every thought, quiet as a shadow. It was a slow dawning, one that arrived like a hesitant guest rather than a welcome presence. Doubt and suspicion wove themselves into the fabric of daily routines, but never as accusations. Instead, they lingered in the pauses between words, in the way hands trembled just slightly when reaching for a glass, or in the sudden sharpness of a tone that quickly softened. The family had stepped onto a delicate tightrope, balancing between what was known and what was feared. The outsider, once a figure of cautious curiosity, became a silent catalyst for change. Their presence, once peripheral, now cast a long and quiet influence over the household. They moved through the rooms with a careful grace, aware of the fragile atmosphere yet unwilling to shatter it further. The family's interactions with them were tinged with a wary respect, a recognition that the old stories could no longer hold the same weight. Yet, no one dared to bridge the gap fully. The truth was a fragile thing, too easily broken by direct confrontation. In private, the family members wrestled with their own emotions, confusion, guilt, and a profound sadness that seemed to seep into the very walls. They found themselves replaying moments from that night, searching for signs they had missed, wondering what might have been different if they had only listened more closely or acted with greater courage. The burden of silence pressed on their hearts, a quiet ache that no apology could soothe. Relationships that once felt unbreakable now bore the faintest fractures, subtle but undeniable. As the days stretched into weeks, the damage revealed itself not in dramatic acts but in the slow erosion of trust and intimacy. The family dinners that had been a sanctuary turned into exercises in polite distance. Conversations that should have been easy became fraught with unspoken tension. The shared spaces in the home felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in on secrets too heavy to bear. Everyone carried the weight of what was left unsaid, and the growing realization that some things, once set in motion, cannot be undone. Belief, when it finally took root, arrived in whispers rather than declarations. It was a quiet acknowledgement in the eyes of a parent, a lingering hesitation before speaking, the softened gaze of a sibling who no longer dismissed the possibility. This acceptance was not a victory or a defeat but a reluctant surrender to a new reality, one marked by fragility and the painful recognition that the past, no matter how tightly held, could not be reclaimed. The family remained together under the same roof, but the bonds between them had changed, stretched thin by the weight of truth and the quiet, irreversible damage it had wrought. Looking back, it's clear now that I was never overreacting. Every instinct, every tear, every moment of silence was a response to an environment that wasn't just challenging, it was unhealthy. The tension, the unspoken resentments, the fragile facades we maintained under the same roof weren't just family quirks. They were signals, warnings that something was deeply wrong. My reactions were not exaggerated emotions but survival mechanisms finely tuned to navigate a home where truth was often silenced, and feelings were dismissed. I wasn't imagining the fractures, I was living them, day by day, trying to preserve myself in the cracks. Trusting myself became an act of courage. For so long, I doubted my perceptions because the world around me insisted they were false or exaggerated. But the late validation I've come to receive isn't just a comfort, it's a confirmation that my voice mattered, that my feelings were valid. This story isn't just about a family that stayed together while breaking apart. It's about the resilience necessary to withstand the weight of unspoken pain and the strength required to finally acknowledge it. Recognizing the truth, even when it disrupts the fragile peace, is an act of self-respect and survival. It's about reclaiming agency in a space that often demands we silence ourselves. The journey wasn't easy or neat. It was messy, filled with moments of doubt and despair, but also glimpses of hope and self-discovery. I learned that survival sometimes means setting boundaries that others may not understand, and that self-trust is the foundation for healing. The family, our shared history, remains a part of me, but it no longer defines the limits of what I can accept or endure. This story is a testament to the power of speaking truth to silence and the necessity of honoring one's own experience, especially when it feels like no one else will. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments. Your stories matter, and your voice deserves to be heard. Like this video if it touched something real inside you, and subscribe for more stories that confront family silence, injustice, and the raw truths we often keep hidden. Together, we can create a space where healing begins, and where no one feels they are overreacting for simply protecting their own well-being.